I'm reading from Matthew 1 through 17. And if you know that one of these names is pronounced differently than the way I pronounce it, I'm sorry. The record of the ancestors of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Aram. Aram was the father of Amminadab. Amminadab was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon was the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David the king. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been the wife of Uriah. Solomon was the father of Rehoboam. Rehoboam was the father of Abijah. Abijah was the father of Asaph. Asaph was the father of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat was the father of Joram. Joram was the father of Uzziah. Uzziah was the father of Jotham. Jotham was the father of Ahaz. Ahaz was the father of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was the father of Manasseh. Manasseh was the father of Amos. Amos was the father of Josiah. Josiah was the father of Jeconiah and his brothers. This was at the time of the exile to Babylon. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel. Shealtiel was the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was the father of Abiad. Abiad was the father of Eliakim. Eliakim was the father of Azor. Azor was the father of Zadok. Zadok was the father of Achim. Achim was the father of Eliad. Eliad was the father of Eleazar. Eleazar was the father of Mathan. Mathan was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Christ. So there were 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 generations from the exile to Babylon to the Christ. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
That was well earned, Janis. Although she is a much kinder and gentler soul than I was there. Her thing of, if you pronounce it differently, then I'm sorry. I'm thinking, well, if you pronounce it differently, I want to know where you went to seminary. No, I appreciate her being gracious with me when I sprung this on her last week and said, yeah, so you're the scripture reader on Easter. Good luck with that. So for those of you who were with us last week, I shared with you on Palm Sunday that all of the preaching helps that I had read wanted me to focus on this question of who is Jesus. But instead, I went rogue and I asked us all to consider, what I think was Matthew's more pressing question for us: who are we? So this week, for those of you that know me, it shouldn't come as a huge surprise that I would go rogue again. I would wander completely off tangent, ignore the Easter morning story for our text altogether, right? Besides, last week the challenge was to consider the question of who are we? This week, after hearing what I expect some of you may have found to be the unexpected in our scripture reading, the question that we need to ask today is, who were they? So I'm going to go ahead and just ask it. Who were these people? Seriously, anyone? Who are these people? Go ahead. Ancestors, yes. That was in the text. That's a freebie.
Well, it was easy.
Yeah. Now, come on now. You all know the joke. For some of us, the holidays are the only time that you and I get to see each other, so we might as well get our money's worth, right? Anyone? Who have we got here?
Patriarchs.
Patriarchs, okay.
King. David.
King David. See,
Rogue women.
some rogue women. I like rogue types. That's good. I'm sorry? The lineage of the Jews, and specifically the kingly lineage.
Murderers.
I'm sorry? Oh, okay. Somebody's figured out where I'm going with this. So that's good. I was, somebody's been spying on Facebook. That's what's going on. Okay. Well, these are all good and correct answers, but I was thinking especially of David. So, King David, who was he? Well, we hinted already at murderer. How about adulterer? We know the story of Bathsheba, where David, in his lust, seduced her and then arranged for what was effectively the murder of her husband, Uriah the Hittite, so he could cover it all up. But you might not have thought about this one, David. How about a warlord? Both 2 Samuel chapter 24 and 1 Chronicles chapter 21 record David's decision to take a census of all of the able-bodied men available for military service, which is followed almost immediately thereafter by God's punishment for taking that military-minded census in the form of a plague that ravaged Israel for 3 days, leaving 70,000 people dead. But why stop there? How about David as war criminal? After returning from battle against the Philistines, the women of the cities of Israel are said to have greeted him and his warriors with songs singing, "David has killed tens of thousands." 1 Samuel even records that a young David struck a deal with King Saul to trade the foreskins of 100 Philistines for the hand of his daughter Michal. And the bloodthirsty maniac went on to provide Saul with 200, just to show off. Okay, so I know that I'm wandering into the realm of the melodramatic a little bit here, but I hope you catch my point. It's not that most of us weren't at least somewhat aware of the fact that David was no saint, but we should be clear. There are days when David was downright despicable, and they're all recorded right there in our book. And yet, in spite of that, being a descendant of King David has routinely been a selling point for the messiahship of Jesus. I'd let that one sink in for a moment, but you heard the list. We've actually got a lot of ground to cover. Now, I should throw in a quick aside here, because Matthew's lineage doesn't actually quite jive with other accounts in the Bible, particularly when he begins to work his way through the kings descending from David. According to the records in the books of Chronicles and Kings, there are some missing players that Matthew has omitted from his list, and there are also a couple of notable misspellings, namely Asaph and Amos, which were most likely actually references to the kings Asa and Ammon, and assuredly not references to the prophets Asaph and Amos. But honestly, that's not even the most interesting part, at least not today, because the people themselves are ultimately far more interesting than any hiccups in Matthew's spelling or chronology. So who are they? They're people with stories to tell, and some of those stories can get kind of hairy. So let's race all the way back to the beginning to our good friend Abraham, patriarch of the nation of Israel. Well, we know already that he almost killed his son as a sacrifice, an act that the Jewish rabbinic teachings have come to question as a moral failing on the part of Abraham, rather than the act of faith that we often associate it with as Christians. But on top of that, there are some other juicy little stories of Abraham during his travels, such as one where he passes off Sarai as his sister rather than his wife. Ostensibly, this is to save his own skin, but ultimately walking away with not only his life, but a small fortune's worth of a local warlord's flocks and slaves in the process for his deception. That's Genesis chapter 20, if you're not quite remembering that one. And trust me, there is going to be a sermon come out of that story one of these days. But it doesn't stop there. If we were to skip to a generation, we get to Jacob, that huckster who teams up with his mother to deceive his aging father Isaac and then con his older brother Esau out of his blessing and his birthright. And that's not mentioning the fact that Jacob, taking a page from that old family playbook apparently, then went on to cheat his uncle Lot out of a small fortune in livestock. Sound familiar? Although that might be a case of turnabout being fair play, since Lot did liquor him up on his wedding night and trick him into marrying the wrong daughter. Now Judah, son of Jacob, he's no moral exemplar either. After all, he did sell his brother Joseph into slavery. But scandal seems to follow scandal in this lineage. For if we read between the lines, we discover that following descendant, Perez, is Judah's son through his daughter-in-law, Tamar. Hang on. There is a logic here. Under Jewish law, when Tamar's husband also Judah's son, died, the next closest eligible male in the family had the responsibility to provide her with an heir in order to preserve the family line for her deceased husband, But Judah's other son, Onan, ultimately refused to provide Tamar with an heir, and that is the G-rated retelling of that story. Genesis 38, for all of those who were looking for a tale that would make Harlequin romance writers blush. So at the end of the story, to make a long one short, Tamar ultimately becomes pregnant by masquerading as a prostitute and tricking her aging father-in-law Judah into sleeping with her, thus giving us Perez. Now, by all rights, under Hebrew and religious law for the day, Tamar was actually the one who was in the right, whereas all the men were the ones actively defying God. But whether we find our scandal in the wildly different sexual taboos of their day or in the rebellion of the men who would not follow God's law, the fact is that the presence of Perez in the lineage of Jesus is just another black eye in the backstory of the Christ. Oh yes, I anticipate a sermon coming out of that story at some point as well. Consider that your fair warning. Now from here we can skip through some relatively unknown folks who don't seem to have any noticeable character flaws. Admittedly, we don't know whether that's because they were flawed people but their stories were never written down, or that they were ultimately good, boring, virtuous people whose stories weren't worth writing. But getting back on point, after skipping over a few folks, we arrive at another relative, unknown, named Salmon. And to be honest, I would have skipped him except for the fact that this is another instance in which the women show up in the story. So in reality, it's not really Salmon that's interesting, it's his wife Rahab who gave birth to Boaz. Now you might recognize Boaz, as in Ruth's Boaz, but Rahab might not seem as familiar, and yet she brings with her a history also. Rahab was the prostitute in Jericho who hid Joshua when he was spying on the city, earning her the instructions to hang the red cord out her window so that she and her family would be spared when the Israelite army stormed the city. And this, of course, leads us to Ruth and Boaz. Now, Ruth comes off a lot better than Rahab might, but as far as the moral calculus goes, she's still a wee bit of a black eye for Jesus too. Because like Rahab before her, Ruth was a Gentile, an outsider that has worked her way into this holy line. And I really am sorry, ladies, I know you keep coming off looking at the very least kind of bad in this genealogy, but stay with me. I can assure you that things are going to be looking up by the end. So moving forward, we don't really know Obed outside of him being Jesse's father, and we really don't know Jesse outside of his description as an elder of the community who was upright before God. But David, well, we've already covered that ground, so let's keep going. Now you might think Solomon is finally going to save this, but while he may have been wise like a serpent, sometimes he was a little too much serpent for his own good. Even though he ultimately inherited the throne at the end of David's reign, he didn't skip a beat when he had the chance to have his older brother, Adonijah, killed off for what essentially could be described as thinking about treason, thus eliminating the last person who was a threat to Solomon's hold on the throne. And not to mention the whole split the baby in two episode. Well, what if both of the women had called his bluff? Who knows how that story would have ended? So from there we go on to King Rehoboam, who managed to lose half the kingdom due to his ineptitude, which in turn led to the creation of the separate northern kingdom of Israel, while David's descendants continued to reign over the southern kingdom in Judah. And following after him were another of other relatively minor war kings, let's call them, whose claim to fame seems to be a series of endless conflicts with the northern kingdom that ended when an alliance with Assyria culminated in Judah becoming a vassal state and Israel becoming a captured territory. Didn't God warn them that this is what they were getting themselves into when they signed up for a king in the first place? Some of us never learn. But beyond that, it becomes a list of relative nobodies who comprise the now failed line of the house of David, continuing down through the Babylonian exile and return, and ultimately concluding in the person of Joseph, the carpenter. But surely, at this point, we've got to ask, is this really the story of Jesus that we want to tell? That he's the descendant of some morally questionable folks with a few Gentiles thrown in for good reason? Or good measure, heir to a long line of failed rulers who were handed the keys to the kingdom only to squander it all away. Yeah, there were some big names in there as far as Jewish history goes, but none of those big names really come out on the other side of this with their hands clean either. I mean, this is one gigantic mess. And that's exactly how God intended it to be. There have been some along the way who have wanted to edit out a few of those more embarrassing sidebars in the lineage of Jesus, but they were missing the crucial point. For God so loved the world that he sent his only son, but don't stop there at the end of verse 16. You have to keep going into that next verse, because God did not send the son into the world to condemn it, but to save it. The purpose of the Christ wasn't so that the cross would stand as a judgment against the world, but so that the empty tomb would stand as a judgment against the cross. For unlike the kingdoms of the earth that would kill and shame and silence and destroy those who wander outside their rules of what is morally upright and politically sanctioned, unlike the cross, that weapon which the world so readily embraces and deploys to do that work of humiliating and destroying and silencing, God instead chose to throw open the tomb and raise up those who have been cast down in shame. God has chosen to throw open the tomb and to build up all that which has been destroyed. God has chosen to throw open the tomb and give voice to all those who have been silenced. And God has chosen to throw open the tomb and give life to everyone whom the world has looked at sideways and uttered, "Crucify them." That murderous adulterer and genocidal war criminal David, the world says crucify him, but God says resurrect him. That poor woman Tamar, caught between the laws of inheritance of her day and the sexual mores of ours, you know deep down inside that we'd just as soon crucify her as look at her, but God says resurrect her. Jacob, that con man and thief, we'd throw him in prison and make sure he never worked again a day in his life with the felony rap sheet that we'd tag him with. But God says, restore him to life. That simple peasant carpenter Joseph, whose claim to fame is that he descended from the line of King David. By that time, who the heck hadn't descended from King David? God could raise up descendants of King David from these stones. The world says we can write this guy Joseph off. But God says this is exactly the kind of person that I will raise up. And Mary, mother of Jesus, she's hardly even there. But a very young girl, married to a much older man, who ends up pregnant, and we find out that it's not even his. Oh yeah, you know where this is going. Crucify her. But God says no. Fill her with life and with joy and with love and with hope, for she is beloved. God says, I will resurrect the Josephs and the Marys of this world, and even the Jacobs and the Tamars and the King Davids of this world. God says, I will raise up you and you and you and you and me and all of us. So great is the love of God that neither life nor death nor angels nor rulers, things present nor yet to come, no powers nor height nor depth can separate us from that resurrection promise that is an empty tomb. Not only is there nothing on this list of morally failed people that can turn God away, it is actually through failed and broken and sinful people just like them, just like me, just like us, that God will continue to roll away immovable boulders, to throw open unenterable tombs, and to call the crucified of this world back to the lives that God says that they and we and everyone ultimately deserves. Who are these people? They are the story of God's salvation. Who are these people? They are you and me and you and you and all of us, and we are the story of God's salvation. That was the good news then. It's the good news today. And it will be the good news tomorrow. So is this still the story of Jesus that we want to tell? Well, I'll tell you what. If that good news from this long line of begats and begots doesn't preach on Easter morning, then I don't know what will. Amen? Amen.